Welcome, everybody. My name is Paul Turner. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes at the top of the hour. While we're waiting for a few more people to join, I want to show you something super cool that we've got coming up here in a few weeks in Houston, Texas. Maybe you've seen some of my posts online with the Commissioning Professionals Society, but we have an amazing day planned on November 10th in Houston, Texas at the University of Houston. Check out the lineup of speakers that we've got for the day. We've got Keith Parrish, who is the commissioning manager for the James Webb Space Telescope. Earlier this year, or end of last year at Christmas, James Webb Space Telescope was launched. And since then, Keith led the team of commissioning to bring the James Webb Space Telescope into service over many months through January into the spring and the summer. And now we're seeing some of the results of those commissioning activities. Just on Wednesday, some more new images were released, the Pillars of Creation, comparing Hubble's resolution to Webb's resolution, and seeing how much more in-depth images and precision we can see from Webb. So it's going to be pretty fantastic to hear from Keith presenting at CPS his efforts and experiences commissioning Webb telescope. We've got some amazing, great presenters as well lined up from all areas of industry, from oil and gas industry, Mr. Ron Malone, Mr. Freddie Valdez, commissioning manager at the Cloud Group. We've got decades of experience from people with a lifetime experience of commissioning, Karen Vierkamp, retired project general manager at BP. So we get to hear from these individuals' experience over a lifetime of commissioning experience. We just don't get access to these individuals walking down the street, but we're going to get to spend the whole day with some of these people, hear their experiences, ask them questions, learn from them. This is really how we learn and get better from commissioning. So definitely check out cpsociety.co, check out our full lineup of presenters here, and definitely get your tickets to participate in the event, because it's going to be a wonderful day, and I encourage you to get involved. So definitely check that out, get your tickets, and I hope to see you there. Okay, give me a couple minutes here. I'll reset. We'll get ready for the presentation, and we'll start in just a couple minutes. Hello everyone, welcome to Commissioning and Startup. We've got another great webinar planned for you today. Today's topic for discussion is how sophisticated is your commissioning? So let's get right into the presentation. So my name is Paul Turner. I'm the CEO and founder of Commissioning and Startup. We're a commissioning agency that helps people and projects implement proper commissioning processes on their projects so they can de-risk their projects and successfully complete them on time and on budget. I've been working on commissioning of complex systems for over 20 years, working in the aerospace industry, commissioning satellites and rockets for the Canadian Space Agency. In the power generation industry, I've worked on a 200 megawatt hydroelectric generating station in northern Manitoba. A few years ago, I was the HVDC commissioning manager for HVDC power transmission project that we delivered on time and on budget. It was a $5.2 billion project, a huge effort, and everybody's collaboration made the project a huge success. And currently I'm working on commissioning of a wastewater treatment plant where we're expanding and upgrading the biological treatment processes to meet higher environmental standards. So I'm working for, or I'm the CEO and founder of the commissioning agency, and on all these types of different complex projects, we work with the project teams to help implement a proper commissioning process, a structured commissioning process that de-risks your project and ensure that commissioning goes successfully at the end of your project. Today we're going to talk about the 4 levels of commissioning sophistication. The levels are level 1, absent commissioning, level 2, Cowboy commissioning, level 3, siloed commissioning, and level 4, integrated commissioning. So let's go through each level here and I'll briefly explain each one of them. The first level is absent commissioning, and really this is an unfortunate state to be in. This is projects where commissioning was really an afterthought. There was nothing included in the budget. There was no planning in advance. Once we get to the end of the project, everybody kind of looks around and realizes that maybe we should try and make this stuff work, but there was no real plan or foresight in advance. The project budget is all spent. There's not much left for commissioning, and everybody's trying to scramble and figure it out. On these types of projects, commissioning is really viewed maybe somewhat as a nuisance. It's maybe a necessary evil, something that has to be done at the end of the project, but nobody really understands the value of commissioning or how it can help deliver the project successfully at the end. Often we hear that commissioning is maybe treated as another subcontract to construction, just like the HVAC subcontractor or the electrical installation subcontractor. Commissioning is just another subcontractor that needs to be on site to do their part and is really working for construction. The result of projects that have absent commissioning is really the project team doesn't understand or isn't aware of the value that commissioning can provide to projects to helpfully or to help mitigate risks and allow projects to be delivered successfully. There's really a lack of early preparation on projects to ensure that commissioning is successful. Sometimes it may be due to an unengaged owner. Maybe the owner isn't looking for a lot of involvement in the project. They're just looking for a turnkey solution. They don't want or need to be involved in the project. They're looking for keys at the end of the project. Just tell us when it's done, and kind of hands off in between there. And really, in this type of scenario where commissioning is absent on projects, commissioning costs, it's viewed as a cost rather than a process that can save money and adds value to projects. In projects that have absent commissioning, that really leads to unsafe work practices. If there's a lot of disorganization, the proper safety protocols aren't being followed, lotto processes aren't enforced, lots of near-miss safety incidents, it's not a good situation to work in for sure. Without any upfront planning or proactive elements to get ready for commissioning, there is often lots of schedule delays. If commissioning was maybe thought to only take a month, well, without any proper planning, then that could be 2 months, 3 months, or a lot more, certainly extending the project in service date. With those delays comes additional cost. The project budget starts to escalate pretty quickly. The days at the end of the project are usually pretty valuable, so each day of delay is costly and adds to the overall capital cost of project. And then because of this, things necessarily aren't being tested thoroughly. We end up with fairly low quality on projects and low reliability, which is detrimental to the life of the plant. If we're not getting the level of reliability that we need out of these facilities, then for the life of the plant for 30, 40, 50 years or whatever that is, that level of reliability is never really achieved, and there's always issues that are cropping up on projects. So it's an unfortunate state, but sometimes just maybe lack of awareness or understanding things can end up that way. Let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced a project like this, or maybe aware or heard of a project like this. If you've worked on a project like this, share your experiences in the comments. I'd like to know if you've encountered this type of project or what your thoughts are related to absent commissioning. Put the word absent in the comments and we'll have a look at those. The next level of commissioning sophistication is called Cowboy commissioning. This is where commissioning is least known in advance that there's a period at the end of the project that commissioning needs to take place. There's elements in the budget, the project budget for commissioning, but still no planning in advance. There's no documentation that's prepared, no checklists, no procedures. Everybody just thinks that we're going to deal with commissioning later. We'll figure it out on the fly. Once we get to site, we'll mobilize the commissioning team to site. You know what? We'll just figure it out then. It's not that big a deal, right? But without that planning in advance, we really end up with projects that are truly the wild, wild west, hence the name of this level of sophistication, where everybody's scrambling, just trying to make things work, trying to figure out what needs to be tested, what order, what sequence of activities need to take place, and it can be quite unsafe as well. Again, it's maybe just because the project team isn't aware. Everybody's focused on design, everybody's focused on construction, but commissioning is kind of that distant process later at the end of the project, and we can deal with that later. Everybody's dealing with the current issues of the project during design and construction and not able to spend any time or focus later to ensure that commissioning is successful. And this is what we do, is to help project teams understand this process and proactively look at some of these risks to mitigate them so that commissioning can be successful. Maybe it's on projects that have just always been done that way. They maybe don't know any different, and it's worked in the past. The last few projects were just kind of a scramble at the end, and that's just the way it is, and it's always been done that way, and that's the way that the next project is going to be done. But with that level of disorganization, there's certainly a higher number of safety incidents because things aren't properly planned and executed meticulously. With Cowboy commissioning, there's really no proactive mitigation strategies during design or during construction to ensure that commissioning is successful. All those potential design issues or installation issues that could have been caught earlier in the project aren't, and instead are deferred to later in the project, the end of the project being commissioning, where all those risks actually come to fruition, are issues that cause delays at the end of the project. The thought process on Cowboy commissioning project may be that it just takes what it takes. We'll figure it out later. If it takes 2 months, if it takes 6 months, whatever, we'll force through it at the end of the project, and we'll just figure it out, and it'll take what it takes. Again, it's pretty disorganized, lots of near misses, lots of lockout, tagout infractions, not a good, safe working environment. The schedule is quite random. It's unknown. We don't know in advance, is commissioning going to take 2 months? Is it going to take 4 months? We really can't forecast what the in-service date of the project is because everything's quite random. Due to the project burn rate, this gets quite expensive too. As the project progresses, the capital costs continue to increase. The end of the project is usually pretty valuable for a day of commissioning, and every day of delay during commissioning can add significantly to the total project cost. And of course, with delays, then there's cost overruns that are going to escalate during commissioning. The quality suffers as well if we're not proactively looking at design and looking at construction with strong design processes and strong quality management systems. Then all those issues get deferred till later in the project and are identified during commissioning, which causes significant delays and cost overruns. So again, let me know in the comments if you've experienced a project like this, if you've been on a project or you've heard of maybe a project that you weren't on, where you experienced this level of kind of Cowboy commissioning. Let me know in the comments. Put Cowboy in the comments and we'll have a look at those and get your feedback on some of your experiences working on projects. The third level is called siloed commissioning. So this is where processes are starting to get a little bit more sophisticated. The design team, the construction team, the commissioning team, they're all working and doing fantastic work, but they're somewhat still siloed and not necessarily working collaboratively between all the groups involved. Often it could be the case that one group, the design group, is throwing things over the fence to construction, or construction is throwing things over the fence to commissioning, but there's that lack of integration between some of the groups and everybody's working in still a bit of a silo. From design, construction, and commissioning, those three critical stages of a project, we're really looking to avoid that the silo of those groups and have everybody collaboratively working together. Sometimes, unfortunately, egos can get in the way. If some of those groups are looking to establish their territory or assert their dominance or protect their group, I've seen cases where some of the silo exists where people are getting into those turf wars, that construction is protecting this, commissioning is protecting that, and that's really not a good situation to get into. We want everybody to be working together collaboratively in the best interest of the project to get to the in-service date successfully, even if that's not a benefit to individually or their group. We want everybody to be contributing to the common goal, the in-service date at the end, and working towards a successful project. So some things that can lead to siloed commissioning is the commissioning team not being at site. While it might be a good idea to start having the commissioning team in the company headquarters, working with a design team collaboratively, working through some of those design issues, we really want to see the commissioning team migrate to site as early as possible. Whenever construction really starts ramping up, then we want to have the commissioning team there as well to work closely with the construction team, build those relationships, establish processes that are in everybody's best interest, and work through some of the details with the team right on site. Sometimes if the commissioning team isn't involved early in the project, then that collaboration isn't allowed to occur. If the commissioning team isn't involved during design, isn't involved during construction, then if the commissioning team only shows up later, then we can end up with somewhat of a siloed environment if the commissioning team comes in late and then, of course, is all suggesting this change or that change, that can be perceived negatively. So we want to have the commissioning team involved earlier to help some of the earlier groups develop these plans and processes and to establish some of these relationships so that we can work collaboratively with everybody. Sometimes if that isn't the case, though, that proactively during design or proactively during construction, there is maybe not quite the level of quality management systems that need to be in place, particularly during construction. If some of those potential risks aren't being identified during construction due to weak quality management, then of course they're going to be deferred to commissioning and found later during commissioning, which is going to impact the overall project and service date. So we want to be working closely with the construction team to ensure that the quality management system that's in place is a strong QMS and is complementing commissioning that will be taking place after. And of course, like I mentioned, if there's any of the design managers, construction managers, commissioning managers, anybody that's allowing kind of that big ego personality to get in the way, then that can somewhat be a barrier to the collaboration that we need to achieve on some of these projects so that we can set commissioning up for success. One thing that can be challenging but is critical to establishing some of these processes is a clear definition of what mechanical completion is, what it constitutes, and who's doing what from the construction side of things and the commissioning side of things, so that we can have a smooth handover from one group to the other. It's critically important to define all the details of mechanical completion up front so that everybody is aware of what their roles and responsibilities are. Everybody knows what's required and when it's required, so that we can build an integrated schedule between construction and commissioning and foster a smooth handover from one group to the other. The results of a siloed commissioning project is, because there's lots going on a project, lots of construction, lots of commissioning, and lots of activities going on in parallel or in adjacent work fronts, sometimes boundary isolations can be a challenge. Boundary isolations are extremely important when the commissioning team is energizing one area of the project and working next to maybe the construction group that's still building a certain area of the project. Maintaining those boundary isolations are critical to keep everyone safe so that the commissioning team isn't energizing into an adjacent work area that the construction team is working in, or vice versa. The construction team isn't coming in and, say, addressing deficiencies, assuming things are in a certain state while commissioning work is taking place and maybe things are being energized that the construction team is not aware of. So we definitely want to break down those silos and encourage close collaboration between groups so that boundary isolations can be maintained and everyone remains safe on the project. With siloed commissioning, often we can see that maybe the construction group has determined a certain construction sequence, but that doesn't necessarily align with startup of the project or how the commissioning team can only start up or test some of this equipment. Often on big projects, there's only one specific sequence that the systems can be started up. There's no opportunity, say, to start up the chemical dosing system if we don't first have the auxiliary power system available to provide power to the system. We can't do those in an opposite sequence unless we're looking at things like getting temporary construction power in place to do that. But through close collaboration between the two groups, if we don't have those silos, early in the project, the commissioning team can help the design groups and the construction groups understand the overall startup sequence and help to align design activities and construction activities to line up with how the project will eventually be started up. And there's lots of opportunity to optimize the overall project schedule and ensure that all phases of the project are happening in the correct order to align with commissioning and startup. If some of those out of sequence activities do take place, that of course is going to lead to delays and of course more costs. If, say, the chemical dosing system is available for commissioning 2 months earlier than the auxiliary power system, well then that 2 months of out of sequence work can impact and cause delays. If 2 years prior to that those discussions had taken place and that proper sequence had been developed in some of those design and construction activities, then we would be able to optimize that 2 months and potentially save some time in the schedule. If strong quality management systems aren't being implemented, then through design, through construction, some of those issues can be propagated later into commissioning and affect our ability to start up the systems and cause delays. Sometimes we hear in the industry, I hear this lots online, that there's a perception that maybe commissioning is working for construction, as in commissioning is just another subcontract and necessary to report to construction and perform their work on site, get in, get out, just like any other subtrade. But we really want to foster a relationship that commissioning is working with construction. We need to collaboratively be working together and planning these detailed handovers and detailed startup sequences. And the more that we can encourage and break down those silos and have the two groups working next to each other and working collaboratively with each other, that helps our projects immensely and prepare for the end of the project for commissioning and startup. So let me know in the comments again if you've worked on a project like this, or you've had experience or know of others that have worked on projects like this. Put the word silo in the comments and we'll see your experiences there. Add a few notes if you want, if you've had any good experiences, any bad experiences, or how you think we can help break down some of these silos and ensure that all groups are collaboratively working together for the benefit of the project. The last level of commissioning sophistication we'll cover here is called integrated commissioning, and this is really the proactive approach to risk management on project to ensure that all the commissioning risks are identified upfront and mitigated upfront during design and construction phases so that commissioning is set up for success. All groups are actively engaged in the project through all phases of the project, with the commissioning team involved earlier during design and construction, and design and construction groups actively and involved in supporting commissioning activities at the end of the project. This is really the benefit of a structured commissioning process where you're starting early in the project, even during the conceptual stage, during procurement stages, to make sure that that knowledge from the end of the project during commissioning is brought forward into the project during procurement, during design phases, to ensure that all the commissioning requirements and all the strategic knowledge from commissioning is brought forward into the project to help with our complex procurement processes and ensure that the right things are established at the beginning of the project that set commissioning up for success. This is really the proper commissioning risk mitigation strategy that needs to take place through all phases of the project, and this is something that we help companies develop and understand and get in place on their large projects so that they can mitigate these risks and successfully deliver their projects on time and on budget. It's not a secret that it's human nature to defer things. Why complete an activity today when it could be completed tomorrow? And that's definitely the case for commissioning. Commissioning could be in 2 years from now, so it's not necessarily everybody's focus or in the forefront of everybody's mind. But by having the commissioning team involved earlier in the project, we can help bring some of that knowledge earlier in the project, help other groups understand some of the risks and decisions that they're making and how that could potentially impact commissioning in a couple years from now, so that the right decisions can be made, the right proactive activities can be taken, commissioning risks can be mitigated so that commissioning is set up for success. So integrated commissioning really involves a properly structured risk mitigation strategy to address some of these risks earlier in the project rather than deferring them to later. Anything that we can do on our major capital projects to de-risk the process or eliminate some of these risks earlier in the project is going to help commissioning be successful. If there's a lack of that proactive risk mitigation, then all those risks just get pushed onto commissioning, and a lot of them will become issues and cause delays. When we have an integrated commissioning project, we're really looking to deliver a higher quality product, something that the operations team can work with for 30, 40, 50 years and have the level of reliability that is required from the assets. And in a lot of cases, some of our critical infrastructure needs that level of high reliability. Through redundancy or through operating processes, that higher level of reliability is required, that quality and reliability, to ensure that our assets are in service when we need them, so that we can rely on and operate these plant processes. When we have an integrated commissioning approach, we have a structured commissioning process and a proper commissioning risk mitigation strategy. Commissioning is set up for a much greater chance of success, and this is what we're striving to achieve on projects so that everybody can deliver their projects on time and on budget. When we're talking about major capital projects, there's a lot at stake. There's millions or billions of dollars at stake. In-service dates are critical so that we can take advantage of opportunity costs to get value out of our assets. There's huge dollars at stake, and we really need to be integrating an integrated approach to commissioning and mitigating a lot of these risks earlier in the project so that we can protect the project investment and not have delays and cost overruns that are costly for everybody involved. A lot of major capital projects involve government money or taxpayer funding, and it's never a good situation to be going over budget on a lot of these projects because it's such a huge drain on limited resources that exist. We want to make sure that we're following properly structured processes to ensure that's not the case. So when we do have a fully integrated commissioning process through all stages of the project, that results in a much safer work environment where lotto processes are properly implemented, safety protocols are implemented, and everybody's working in a safe working environment to minimize the number of near misses, hopefully zero, to achieve the end goal of the project. We do get an integrated construction and commissioning schedule, which is critical to have all the construction activities complementing the commissioning activities and vice versa, the commissioning activities complementing the construction activities, and getting that full level of integration, breaking down those silos and having everybody working together to develop this complex plan is critical when we're implementing an integrated approach to commissioning. By having that level of collaboration, we're developing our schedule in much more detail, where all of our mechanical completion milestones are crystal clear, who needs to do what and when they need to be done, so that there's no impacts to the project in service date. An integrated approach to commissioning is really the lowest risk approach to maintain cost certainty on projects, and implementing this approach can definitely save a lot of time and a lot of money on projects, which is what we want to achieve. And we can achieve that high level of reliability that are required on a lot of our projects for the life of the assets. So again, in the comments, let me know if you've experienced a project that's functioned in this manner, where an integrated approach to commissioning has been throughout all stages of the project. Write integrated in the comments. We'll have a look and look at your comments as we go. So really, when we're talking about the 4 levels of commissioning sophistication, we're looking for that proactive commissioning risk mitigation during all project phases to ensure that risks aren't just being deferred as we'll deal with that later, we'll figure that out during commissioning, we've got too much on our plate right now, we just need to focus on this one issue. We need to look at that proactive approach to mitigating risks to commissioning to know that our project is going to be successfully completed. Because it's one thing to start a project, everybody's keen, everybody's working on their activities and plowing forward, but if we're starting projects without having a crystal clear picture of how we're going to finish them, then it's going to get quite challenging as we move along. We need to know how we're going to start projects, but we also need to know how we're going to finish them so that we have a clear idea from all stages of the project in how we're going to get to the in-service date successfully. A lot of times we might encounter design errors or installation errors during commissioning. These are unfortunate, but by implementing an integrated approach to commissioning, the commissioning team can help some of the groups during design and help some of the groups during installation implement proper processes, review processes, risk mitigation processes to ensure that there's less of a chance, or hopefully no chance, of major design errors cropping up later in the project, or major installation errors that are cropping up during commissioning that are being encountered. I'll give a small example of an installation error. If we've simply got just a rolled cable and a backwards signal, that through a proper quality management system, if we're going through, we're doing our Megger testing and our point-to-point testing thoroughly, that we would hope is identified during the installation phase during construction. But something as simple as that, if it's missed, or there is no point-to-point checks or quality control, or it's not to the level of scrutiny that needs to be required, then that one cable can potentially delay commissioning by half a day or a day, as we discover the error, troubleshoot what it is, find the rolled cable, and then get it fixed. That one day of commissioning could be extremely valuable. If our project burn rate is in the order of millions of dollars, then that one day delay has just cost the project, say, $1 million. Well, that one cable, that rolled cable, is all of a sudden a very expensive cable. That's a pretty valuable cable that caused one day of delay to the project. We want to be looking at getting to that level of commissioning sophistication to find those errors earlier so that we don't encounter those delays later in the project. During our front-end engineering design, the commissioning team can definitely help with aligning some of the systematization that will be taking place in how the project will be started up later, and helping the design group understand what are those design packages that need to be available and when they need to be available to support construction, to therefore support commissioning. Really, all of those phases during design and construction should line up with the eventual startup sequence to get to in-service date. If we know that we need the HVAC system first, then that should be something that the design team is working on first to get to the construction team. The construction team should be working on that first to give to commissioning team as one of the first things that's planned for startup, as an example. Or even at a big block level, if we know that we need certain aspects of the AC power switch yard, say we need bays 2 and bays 3 first, then we can help to align the design team to understand those deliverables being required first, that the construction team can work on those items first in the correct order, knowing that during commissioning and startup, those are the first parts of the project that we're going to need first to be able to continue with commissioning and startup. That is really a sequence that startup sequence drives all of the activities through procurement, through integrated factory acceptance testing, through commissioning, and through startup, and is really the backbone that sets the priorities for all stages of the project through design and construction to ensure that they line up with commissioning and startup. During procurement, the commissioning team can definitely add value to help some of the earlier groups understand the impacts of some of the decisions that are being made during major contract procurement, the strategy and structure of how procurement's taking place, the involvement of some of the groups when they're involved, the strategy, the structure, and a lot of the commissioning requirements that can sometimes get missed earlier during procurement. If procurement's happening 3-5 years in advance, that may not necessarily be everybody's upfront focus on commissioning. We sometimes see contracts where commissioning is maybe only a few lines in the contract, we'll figure it out later. But by bringing that commissioning experience earlier into the project, we can bring a lot of those details for scope of commissioning, the details of mechanical completion, and what are the commissioning requirements earlier into contracts. This can be a huge point later in the project. If a lot of these details aren't defined in advance, then as soon as you get to construction and those discussions are taking place, well, if say mechanical pipe flushing wasn't in the contractor's scope of work to complete, well, then if that's something you need them to do later, that's an extra, of course. So it can add up pretty quickly. If these details aren't included and they need to be done by certain groups later in the project and need to make changes, then it's quite costly to do that. The claims, the extras can add up pretty quickly. Something that's critically important from a commissioning risk mitigation perspective is implementing a proper integrated factory acceptance testing. Sometimes this can get missed, as it would be, say, something that's going to be figured out during commissioning, but With the complexity of today's projects, the level of automation, the level of controls, the level of PLC logic, it's way too risky to have that first hardware and software integration taking place on site during site acceptance testing or site integration testing for the first time. To mitigate that risk in the complexity of these systems, it's critically important to institute a proper integrated factory acceptance test program in the factory before your automation cubicles even leave the factory to get to site. It does mean that some of the design efforts need to be advanced, the cubicle design and the logic design, but that's how we mitigate the risk on our projects, is by structuring them in this manner to ensure that some of these upfront activities are done earlier and these risks aren't deferred to later in commissioning. So by having the commissioning team involved earlier, we can help develop some of these integrated factory acceptance test requirements and ensure that design and construction activities are in the proper sequence so that we're not deferring all that risk to commissioning and causing huge delays later in the project. During construction, implementation of a strong quality management system is important, from a quality control perspective by the contractor, from a QA oversight by the group that's responsible to do that. This is the opportunity to find any minor defects or any installation errors that are going to cause problems later during commissioning. By instituting a proper and thorough quality management system, we can ensure that the equipment in the field is installed as intended in the issued for construction drawings, or any markups are complete for red line drawings, to know that the equipment is installed correctly and not cause issues later during commissioning. So a close collaboration between the construction group and the commissioning group to ensure that the right activities are proactively being identified and taken care of in advance is hugely beneficial to commissioning and hugely beneficial to delivering your projects on time and on budget. As well, aligning with how the project is systematized for commissioning and startup. If the construction groups are working on portions of the project in the right order that they'll be commissioned and started up, that allows a huge efficiency to overlap some of the construction activities and some of the commissioning activities to align with startup and the in-service date of the project. Helping some of the groups understand how the project is going to be started up is hugely beneficial to ensure that everybody's working to the same common goal. We really want to establish that startup sequence early in the project and ensure that everybody is following the same sequence of activities that exactly aligns with the project startup sequence. When we're getting to commissioning, we want to be preparing all of our plans, all of our procedures, all of our checklists well in advance of on-site commissioning. Once detailed designs are available, once we have cubicle designs available and IO lists, PLC logic in place, then we can go through the details and prepare all of our plans, procedures, and checklists to ensure that all documentation is hand. We're ready to go once we get to site. There's no guesswork whatsoever. We've got all of our documentation prepared. Once we get to site, it's strictly execution. We know exactly what to do. We know exactly when it's going to take place, and we can execute to precision based on all of our documentation prepared in advance. Without this, then this is where we get into areas of cowboy commissioning. If there's not a proper level of documentation defining what we're going to do, then things become a bit of a scramble to figure out on the fly and will take much longer to complete. With the complexity of today's projects, we really want to manage a commissioning management software suite of tools. There's a crushing amount of information that's available on projects these days. And if we don't have a system to manage the information, manage the documents, ensure that the right information is in the hands of the right people at the right time, then we pretty quickly get overwhelmed. Managing complex projects using paper and spreadsheets really isn't appropriate anymore. It can things get lost pretty quickly. And during design and construction, there's some big things that are being managed. Think of, say, a large oil-filled transformer. That's a pretty big item, and everybody will it's human nature to want to focus on the large portions of the project, but even the tiniest of little details can impact commissioning. If there's a protection setting that's not correct on that large transformer, then when we go to energize it, it'll trip off or it won't function correctly just due to one tiny little setting. So we need to be managing all of these details, the big details and the little details, everything in a CMS, so that we can manage the issues, track the risks, and ensure that nothing's getting missed through all stages of the project, so that even the tiniest little setting that's not correct is tracked and identified and corrected before we get to commissioning. In advance of commissioning, the commissioning team is also working on preparing a realistic and achievable schedule with all groups involved, with the design groups, with the construction groups, to ensure that we get all stages of the project integrated correctly. And we'll also be looking at some of the contingencies that exist within the commissioning sequence as well, because despite all of our best efforts for risk mitigation during design and during construction and during commissioning, there's still delays that can potentially occur. Even if, say, a large high voltage standoff has been factory acceptance tested and passed testing, even though it went through the high voltage facility and passed high pot testing in the high voltage test facility, we've gotten to site and we've energized that particular standoff. There's issues that happen if that device does still have a latent defect that got through all those stages of testing, and after a week or two of operation it fails and needs to be replaced. There's still those issues that can exist, so we still need to be having some contingencies in place should those issues exist, if it means having a spare of items that could potentially fail, if it means having an alternate sequence where we maybe move over to a different portion of the project and move on to commissioning there while that long lead item is procured. We need to be looking at those contingencies as well, because even if those issues do occur, we can't stop. We still have to be making progress. We still have to be working towards the project and service date. So what are the options that exist if some of those issues do occur, and what are the contingencies that we can plan for? Projects are evolving even further, getting to even higher levels of advanced commissioning risk management. We talk about things like virtual commissioning, and when I heard about this a few years, I thought, well, yeah, nobody's going to sit on Zoom and virtually commissioning something from halfway across the country. That seems ridiculous, but that isn't actually what virtual commissioning refers to. Projects are getting sophisticated enough where a lot of the hardware is modeled in software to a high enough fidelity that we can use those software models to test some of our control logic for systems without actually needing the hardware. This is different than modeling on the projects. Modeling has occurred on projects for decades. As soon as computers were invented, people leveraged the ability to model a project and forecast some of the aspects of design. But this is taking that to that next level and getting a high enough fidelity of a digital twin, a model of the project, that we can actually use that. We can drop our PLC logic code within that digital model and use that to test and verify our PLC logic without even needing a second set of cubicles or cubicles in the factory to test some of the hardware. This is getting to higher levels of sophistication on projects, but this is where the industry is going, to be able to leverage the technology exists and use this technology to mitigate risks on projects. By getting into some of the virtual commissioning aspects, that allows the hardware cubicles to get to site a little bit earlier, while virtually we're still commissioning and proving out some of the design elements of the PLC logic before we do that integration in site. So these are definitely things that we're going to want to be pursuing over the next few years to leverage the technology that exists. One of the presentations I'm looking really forward to at CPS in Houston in a few weeks is Keith Parrish's presentation on commissioning of the Webb telescope. There's a lot that we can learn from advanced commissioning in the aerospace industry. Commissioning in space is really all done after launch. So when Webb was launched on December 25th, 2001, all of the commissioning, the 6-month commissioning period, was post-launch. So getting Webb to Lagrange point 2 and all of the testing and commissioning to deploy all the deployables, align all the mirrors, all the testing that needs to be done in orbit, that can only be done in orbit, to prove that all the systems are functioning and that Webb is ready for operation to take some of the amazing pictures that we've seen. This is extreme high levels, advanced levels of commissioning risk management, because you don't have access to the hardware anymore. It has to work. When we're commissioning on the ground, we're looking at the HMI. It's somewhat similar to commissioning in aerospace, the difference being that when an issue is encountered, you can't walk over to the hardware and make a physical change to the equipment. When you're commissioning in space, proactive risk management is critical because you don't have access to the hardware anymore, and it must work. So high levels of redundancy, lots of proactive risk mitigation to ensure that that period of commissioning post-launch is successful, and you really only have access to the software. Making any software changes, no access to the hardware anymore. So there's a lot that we can learn from the aerospace industry to bring some of those proactive risk mitigation strategies into our ground-based commissioning to make sure that we can deliver our projects on time and on budget and successfully get our systems in service, exactly like the Webb telescope. This is what we do at commissioningandstartup.com. We help companies understand the commissioning risk management process through all stages of the project to ensure a proactive risk mitigation strategy exists to set up structured processes to help establish some of the documentations that is required in order to ensure that projects are successful. We really want to see projects implement a structured commissioning process, go through some of these proactive activities during procurement, during integrated factory acceptance testing to ensure that projects are successful through all phases of the project, to see all groups working together towards that common goal of the in-service date. We really want to implement a de-risked commissioning process. We don't want to see a lot of those risks deferred to later in commissioning. We want to proactively look at de-risking the project, de-risking commissioning, and establishing a lot of those processes, integrating commissioning through all of those processes during design and construction so that commissioning, startup, and in-service date are all successful. It's really that proactive level of commissioning risk management that we want to get to on big projects, small projects, all levels of projects to ensure that everyone can deliver their projects on time and on budget with collaborative, proactive approach to commissioning risk management. Now, if you're interested in seeing what a de-risked commissioning process looks like, I encourage you to go to commissioningandstartup.com/mini-course. We've got a 3-day mini course that walks you through and shows you exactly what this de-risked commissioning process looks like. It's a short little mini course. It gives a great introduction. It's over 3 days. Each day is maybe only 10 or 15 minutes where you can check out the information. You can see each stage of the project and how you can implement a de-risked commissioning process. And this is critically important to delivering your projects on time and on budget, so I encourage you to go check that out. commissioningandstartup.com/mini-course. Go check that out. So that's what I've got for you here today. We've covered some the various levels of commissioning sophistication and how you can achieve those levels of sophistication on your projects. I'm available for some questions. If there's any questions, drop them in the chat, and I'll go through your questions now. But I really encourage you to dive into this information. If you're working on projects in any manner, on design, on construction, on commissioning, if you're involved in projects in any way, then it's definitely beneficial to understand the levels of commissioning sophistication that you can achieve on your projects to be able to deliver them on time and on budget. So definitely go check out the mini course, commissioningandstartup.com/mini course. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them right now. So the first question I see is, yes, I've been in a project with the absence of commissioning, a turnkey plant, and even the startup was done by the contractor nearly without the involvement of the operations team. As I was in the operations team, we were inexperienced and suffered all types of failures like pipelines clogged, instrumentation and equipment failure. It took over a year to have the plant operate smoothly. Yeah, we can see this being the case. Because there was no proactive element of mechanical pipe flushing, someone on the project maybe would have decided that we can save some time on the project. You know, we don't need to flush those pipes. We'll figure that out later. If there's a clog, we'll just deal with it. But we can see from Frank's explanation here that there was over a year of delays trying to sort out all those issues. Because pipes were clogged, then things have to be taken apart and flushed properly and put back together. Maybe that takes a couple days. Well, that halts commissioning while those issues are sorted out. So while it may be short-sighted to see or the thought process to skip some of these upfront activities, it never works out in the end. There's always more delays later in the project. And if it did take a year to sort that out, think of that lost opportunity cost. Maybe that in-service date was critical. If this was, say, a food processing plant On that first day of in service, it was expected that the plant would be operational and generating revenue for the company. Well, that opportunity is lost. So add in those lost opportunity costs, add in the delay costs of the project team being around longer, the additional capital outlay, the interest and escalation costs of the project. And this can be hugely expensive just because someone thought it would save some time by not flushing the pipes in advance. You also make a good point, Frank, on involving the operations team. That is critically important to encourage that smooth handover from construction to commissioning, and from commissioning to operations, is having the owner's operating team involved as early as we can. Having that operational insight is hugely beneficial to ensure that these systems can be operated and maintained correctly, and also to give the operations team a level of comfort so that at the end of the project they're not surprised or drop the keys and say, hey, figure this out, good luck guys. We want to encourage that soft handover, and commissioning is the time for operations to see that, where they can participate in commissioning, be involved in the troubleshooting, work shoulder to shoulder with a lot of the equipment experts that are on site during the project, see the issues, ask questions, get a level of comfort and familiarity with the systems to ensure that at the end of the project they're ready to operate and maintain the new facilities. Next question we've got from Adam is absent, been there where a city passes off type 2 duct for a wood burning pizza oven, absent fire rated enclosure and welded duct. Fan was not rated for smoke or grease. It had to be removed and replaced. So there's another good example. If that company was looking to get those facilities in service and start generating revenue from their new installations, well, they weren't able to do that because their equipment wasn't properly tested, designed and tested, and now they're encountering more delays. So they're shut down for a longer period of time as those issues are addressed during commissioning. Had some of those proactive activities taken place, that would have been identified much earlier, probably when there was still a time to address some of those issues, replace equipment and get them up to where they needed to be so that it's ready for commissioning and no delays to the in-service date. So very good question for sure. Another comment we've got is related to Cowboy commissioning. I recently ran away from a project without systematization, no logic sequence prepared, and no procedures, all just 1 month before mechanical completion. And this can often be the case. If we can see projects aren't being planned properly and that they're going to be unsafe, then it's not in our best interest, or it's unsafe to even be able to participate in this. I see this on some projects where people just say they can't participate in this because it's too crazy, it's too unorganized, and it's dangerous, as you're forced to leave the project and seek other opportunities. And that's frustrating because if there's good people working on projects with good commissioning experience that want to help and want things to succeed, but it's just not possible because maybe some of the upfront activities aren't taking place properly, then there's not much you can do. And unfortunately, some good people then maybe are forced to leave projects and seek other opportunities. By having the commissioning team involved earlier, we can help projects understand some of these decisions that are being made and how they can impact later aspects of commissioning so that we can hopefully avoid these situations. But yeah, if the commissioning team is brought in too late and that opportunity was missed, there's sometimes little that can be done. If the commissioning team is brought in late, then really all we can do at that point is point out issues and that need to be addressed. But we've lost that proactive ability to help the project be successful. Next question. I've been in numerous projects where commissioning is absent due to a lack of knowledge. The absent merges with Cowboy's contractors that do not cooperate. There sometimes is competing interests on projects. If that opportunity to proactively have that commissioning knowledge involved in the procurement phases in contracts, if those things are missed in contracts, then that can set the project up for competing priorities. If the contractor's priority is established in contracts that they need to meet a certain date, but maybe the level of quality wasn't defined, or mechanical completion wasn't clearly defined, then the contract motivates them to want to complete on that specific date, even if some of the proper activities aren't specified and aren't done. Whereas from the owner's side, of course, the owner wants to inherit a fully functional system that can be reliably operated and maintained for many years to come. Those competing priorities can exist, right? And that's why we need to have the commissioning team involved earlier in the project. So during that procurement phase, we can help align some of those priorities and ensure that the right items, the right activities are identified in contracts, and everybody is motivated in the same regard to the best benefit of the project. It's critically important. The contract structure and the details of what's included in contracts, the level of mechanical completion definition, are critically important to ensure that everybody's intentions, motivations are aligned on projects, and everybody's working together to that common outcome for a successful project in service date. Next question, was commissioning a lost part of construction projects? Is it not the project manager's job to ensure proper function? You're absolutely right. From a project manager's perspective, the design manager, the construction manager, and the commissioning manager would all report to the project manager. On a lot of projects that are large in nature, there's an overwhelming amount of work to be done, and sometimes that end of project focus can be lost or missed, or not even able to be worked on, because the project manager and the design manager are very much focused on the design phase of the project, or the project manager and the construction manager are very much focused on the construction portion of the project. But you're right, it's really the project manager's ability to foresee all stages of the project over many years, if it's a 3 or 5 year project, and understand how some of those decisions that are being made between the project manager and design are going to impact commissioning 4 or 5 years later. Project managers having that level of commissioning experience is critically important, and if it doesn't exist, then the project managers at least foresight to bring construction or commissioning managers and portions of the commissioning team involved earlier in the project to help the project manager, to help the design manager understand some of those earlier phases of the project, and understand how some of those earlier decisions are going to impact commissioning later. So it does take a very strong project manager to ensure that all of those aspects of the project or design are aligned, or at least to have a strong project manager that recognizes the importance of commissioning, but recognizes that they don't necessarily have all the answers, and ensure that the commissioning team is brought in earlier in the project to bring that project knowledge, that foresight, and help everybody to understand all phases of the project. So since I started in commissioning, I have already been involved in level 2, level 3, and level 4 projects, and the ones that were finished were without a doubt level 4 projects. Absolutely, yeah. Same experience for me. Even working on mega projects, multi-billion-dollar projects, you can see aspects of the projects that were fully integrated, that level 4 of integrated commissioning. Those were the portions of the projects that went smoothly and were delivered on time and on budget. The portions of the project that by maybe other contractors or other systems in the project that didn't follow that maybe ended up with some siloed commissioning or even Cowboy commissioning, those were the projects that struggled. Those were the pieces of the project that were years late and millions of dollars over budget. So I agree with you. Without a doubt, the only projects I've ever seen be successful are those level 4 projects that are fully integrated through all stages of the project. Any level 1, 2, 3 projects that I've been part of, or maybe brought in later in the project to help clean up or sort out or get commissioning into some sort of more better state, all of those projects have been late and over budget. That really the only way to be successful on today's projects is to achieve that level 4 integrated level of commissioning through all stages of the project. So I definitely agree with your comment, Basilio. What risks have you seen in commissioning lithium plants? So I've never actually been involved in commissioning a lithium plant, but I imagine it would be similar to commissioning any type of manufacturing plant, really commissioning any industrial plant process. The risks are very similar. There'd be very specific technical risks, but the overall effect of implementing a proper integrated risk management process through all stages of the project is you're going to reduce those technical risks having an impact later in the project. If they're addressed during design, if they're addressed during commissioning, installation issues, then regardless of the specific project type or the specific technical types of risks, you're going to reduce those and allow commissioning to be successful later in the project. So while I don't have any specific lithium plant examples, the process applies to any industrial plant process, whether it be oil and gas, manufacturing facilities, food processing facilities, power distribution, power generation, oil, wastewater treatment, water treatment, any type of plant process where you would maybe assume that there's an operating team that's going to be staffing the facilities and operating the facilities after. This level of proactive risk mitigation is required and can significantly help projects succeed when commissioning risk management is integrated through all stages of the project. Where I would say I get lots of questions related to building commissioning, and while building commissioning is critically important and is one aspect of the project, it's maybe one smaller aspect where commissioning of the building would be regards to getting the building envelope and some of the life safety systems in place for fire detection, fire suppression, lighting systems, anything that would be required to achieve the occupancy permit. But where commissioning risk management really shines is kind of at that next level of all of the equipment in the building, all the equipment outside of the building, the specific electrical, mechanical, and automation equipment intended to implement the actual plant process within the building. That's where things can get quite more complex and risky, and that's where an integrated approach to commissioning risk management is critical to ensure that all of those equipment specific electrical, mechanical, automation issues are addressed earlier in the project to ensure commissioning is successful. How much is the readiness of relevant documents such as MOSs, PCDs, can affect the commissioning process? A lot of the, if you're referring to the specific commissioning documentation that's required, that's critically important for the execution of commissioning. But even as we get into some of the operational documents, say safe work procedures or safe operating procedures, any coordinated control of operations, say with a new plant facility, with an existing plant facilities, those really need to be developed during the commissioning phase as well, and commissioning can definitely support that. A lot of our switching procedures that we're using during commissioning can be the basis and used for operating procedures or maintenance isolation protocols that are needed for operations later in the project. If we're referring to some of the PCN, process control narrative, or functional requirement specification, those definitely impact commissioning. Those need to be prepared much earlier in the project as part of design, because the PCN and FRS really define the level of commissioning that's going to be required and how we're going to commission some of these systems in how they need to operate. The PCN, the process control narrative, really defines how the automation system needs to manage and control the plant process on site. So the PCN is our direct reference when we're putting together our commissioning procedures in how we're going to test these systems, the scenarios that need to be tested, all the normal operating scenarios, all the fault operating scenarios, and how each of these are going to be tested during commissioning. So we're using that as our baseline to prepare our commissioning procedures, how we're going to operate these. A lot of our testing isn't taking place with actual real process fluids, so we need to determine a way, how are we going to test this? If we don't have that specific input available because process fluids aren't available, then how are we going to simulate that system, or how are we going to engage that field device to ensure that we're getting that stimulus to the system to allow the process to execute. So I hope that answers your question. Why is it very difficult to sell the commissioning plan to the contractor? This makes the process of developing a commissioning integration plan very difficult. And I agree. If this isn't upfront defined in the procurement contracts, then that may not be in the contractor's best interest to want to participate. Often that's the case because commissioning wasn't a forefront in the discussion during procurement. There may be limited commissioning knowledge or maybe even none, or maybe that's not even the contractor's scope of supply. But without that clear definition up front of what needs to be done and who needs to do it, then the contractor may not be interested in participating in that because it's not in their best interest. The contract defines something slightly different, that their goal, their motivation is to achieve their installation complete. Not necessarily if the quality requirements weren't explicitly identified or explicitly met, then again, it's hard to enforce that on the contractor, and they're going to work to the contract. That's why we need to have a lot of these upfront discussions during the procurement phase to ensure that all activities are aligned and we can have these discussions with contractors later, that the contractors are motivated and willing to participate in commissioning activities to ensure the best outcome of the project. Without that upfront alignment before contracts are even signed, then exactly like you're describing, Cello, that's the situations that we get in, that the contractor doesn't want to engage in those discussions because it's not their role, it's not their responsibility, and it's not in their best interest to finish their scope of work and get paid. They want to complete their scope of work, they want to get off the job, they want to get paid and move on to their next job. That's how they make their money, right? So we need to have those discussions up front during contract development, during procurement, even having contractors submit their commissioning team, their plan, their involvement to assess their level of sophistication and their ability to support the commissioning program later upfront in the project so that we can avoid these situations. Next question I've got is, I'm a project control guy having 10 plus experience in design and construction in the oil and gas industry. What to pursue in the commissioning area? What are your suggestions? So from a project control perspective, that's an important group that we rely on as we're preparing our commissioning plans earlier in the project. We're relying heavily on the project controls group. One second. Sorry, we're relying heavily on the project controls group to be that bridge between design, construction, and commissioning and develop that fully integrated project controls perspective, particularly from a schedule perspective. So from an area to pursue in commissioning, it's definitely beneficial for everybody to working on projects to understand the structured commissioning process and how commissioning is integrated into all stages of the project, integrated into design, integrated into construction to ensure that commissioning is successful at the end of the project. So we've got some training courses if you're interested. I definitely encourage you to check those out. Go to commissioningandstartup.com. You can see the training that we're providing there. That would be a great place to start to understand how commissioning integrates into all of your project controls perspective, from a schedule perspective, from a planning perspective, from a contingency perspective, and from a risk mitigation perspective. The commissioning team can definitely help and provide information to the project controls groups to ensure that all groups are integrated together and aligned and working towards the same common goal. So definitely check that out. I was involved in siloed kind of commissioning project. The construction team was solely on top of QA/QC. Barely 6 years after commissioning, it turns out the vessel material was not very suitable for its prevailing conditions. These vessels had to be replaced one at a time. Yes, this could maybe sounds like it could be a design issue, or maybe it was an installation issue for sure. But again, by getting the commissioning team involved earlier, we can help to look at some of those items during design and see if there's reliability or suitability issues. And again, yeah, during QA/QC, look into those processes, ensure that the right checks and balances are in place to hopefully catch some of these items. This one does sound like a very unfortunate issue here. If some of the vessel material is failing kind of post project, that maybe seems, or it would seem like something maybe wasn't specified quite correctly to withstand the harsh environment that you're operating in. Having some of those upfront design reviews, or in this case maybe operational involvement during design to see some of these items, or maybe share that level of experience on similarly operating vessels to ensure that these items are going to last once they're placed into service, and we don't run into these issues where they have to be replaced during normal operating conditions. Next question is, why pre-commissioning and commissioning are the same teams for nowadays projects? Before it was different. Do you think it's for keeping the budget low? It depends maybe on the complexity of projects. I've worked on projects where the pre-commissioning team and the commissioning team are the same group of individuals, but it depends on maybe what's being commissioned. Certainly for different levels of pre-commissioning, different groups would be involved in. You wouldn't have your telecommunications group working on doing some of the comms checks between your cubicles. You wouldn't have that group also doing the mechanical flushing of piping. There's definitely specialized skill sets that need to come into the project at certain times of the project to allow or give their expertise to that particular phase of the project. So we can see groups that aren't 100% dedicated to commissioning, but they are the groups that come in for 2 or 3 weeks of testing and do their specialized testing and then move on to a different project. But the core commissioning team would likely still be the same team, because they're the ones that are overseeing the whole process and ensuring that the right people are involved at the right time and that the right specialized skill sets are available. For some of the specialized equipment commissioning, we're relying heavily on vendors being involved. The vendor manufacturer of a particular piece of equipment is going to be the most knowledgeable to perform their site acceptance testing, their vendor startup checks. We're not necessarily trying to figure out, as the commissioning team, how to start up that particular piece of equipment. We're bringing the vendor on site, and they're going to be responsible for getting their piece of equipment started up and ready for then further commissioning by other groups as that particular item is commissioned and integrated with other portions of the project. So we maybe can't say that it's one group or the other, if it's separate pre-commissioning team or commissioning team, if that should be split, if it should be together. I think it depends on the type of project and what level of specialized skills are required given the specialized aspects of the project. We need to look at that, and just the important part out of that, I guess, is make sure that the right people are involved at the right time. And again, I know I've said this a bunch of times in this presentation, but that's another aspect why it's critically important to have the commissioning team involved earlier in the project to identify who needs to be involved, when they need to be involved, what scope of work they're going to be complete, so that we have this crystal clear picture prior to on-site commissioning of how all these activities are going to take place and when they're going to take place, and lining up all these specialized individuals involved. So some definite proactive thought process into how this is all going to work is critical to make sure that the right people are involved. Second part of that question, what would you advise for an electrical and instrumentation QC inspector to switch to a commissioning position? From where to start? So having a QC background is hugely beneficial to the commissioning team. Anybody that's been involved in the installation aspects and understands all the code requirements, the detailed how a lot of the contract requirements translate into installations in the field, and what to look for is hugely beneficial. I've worked with some fantastic people on my commissioning teams that have had this level of installation experience, and it's hugely beneficial and a rare skill to find. So if you're looking to transition from QC to commissioning, that I definitely encourage that, because that would be a huge benefit to commissioning teams to have that level of installation experience. One thing that might help you maybe is kind of what we've talked about here in the overall commissioning process, that integrated structured commissioning process and the steps involved to go through here. Our training gives an excellent overview of what this de-risk commissioning process looks like. So check out our training. That's probably a good place to start. Go to commissioningandstartup.com. At the top of our page, you'll see a training section there. There's a few options for training. You can check that out. And that's what those programs go into, is the detailed process of what this de-risk commissioning process looks like. That would be a good place to start to help you understand the details of what this looks like and how you can translate your QC inspector knowledge into this de-risk commissioning process through the last stage of the project. So definitely check that out. Once you've checked it out, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'd be happy to help you out. The biggest problem for commissioning is where different verticals and stakeholders are involved. You don't think the cross integration and coordination of drawings for different are very critical? What do you think about that? Supply chain management is also very critical, and contract management and logistics for heavy machinery is a very big problem from international locations is very critical. I agree with all of that completely, yep. We need to be leveraging a lot of the software tools that can exist. When you're talking about integration and coordination of drawings for different disciplines are very critical. I agree completely, where you can sometimes see, even within a particular stage of the project during the design phase that there was maybe some silos that exist between or within those groups as well. The electrical designers maybe weren't talking to the mechanical designers as often or as closely as they should have been. Once we get to site and start doing some of the installation, we find out that the cable tray is supposed to be installed in the exact same location as a mechanical piping. Obviously that doesn't work, but leveraging some of the software tools that exist, we can identify some of these clashes in advance. There's sophisticated 3D modeling design programs that exist that need to be used so that everybody's working into the same design and not assuming that the same spaces are available. With the 3D modeling softwares that exist on projects that have used those, it's pretty clear to see well in advance before getting to site for installation where the clashes are, and looking at that constructability element to make sure that everybody's working together and that things can actually be built in the field, things that can be operated successfully in the field. Supply chain management, especially these days during the pandemic, post-pandemic, has been a huge problem, and I don't know when the world finally settles out and gets back to some level of stability, but it's definitely a challenge. We're seeing delays in long lead items, delays from overseas international shipping, issues with the Suez Canal a year or two ago, where blockages were delaying things. It's a huge challenge for sure, and procurement and delivery of equipment is a huge area of the project to manage during construction for getting equipment to site. That's definitely a very specific discipline that we rely on from the design and the construction teams to manage these procurements, manage these supplies, and ensure that equipment is getting to site as originally identified in procurement contracts. It's definitely a risk to be mitigated. I would say from a commissioning perspective, we'll get involved in some of the technical requirements in defining what needs to be tested in advance on equipment, how some of the factory acceptance testing needs to be done, how some of this stuff needs to be delivered to site, and how it needs to be started up, say from a vendor startup perspective. But the commissioning team typically wouldn't get involved in managing a lot of those supply risks. The individuals that are responsible for that procurement, if that's the contractor that's issuing that procurement contract for that particular item, then we're relying and expecting the contractor to be managing those risks so that they can achieve their installation timelines. If they're expecting equipment on site at a certain date, then we're relying on them to manage those procurement risks so that they can get it on site when they need it to be able to complete their installation activities. The commissioning team is certainly monitoring for sure, because we want to be aware if there's any delays, if there's going to be any delays to installation or delays to commissioning, and we'll assist in any way that we can, but we're relying on the procurement experts to be able to manage those risks and get equipment to site when needed. So definitely a challenge and definitely a good question. Next question. I'm a plant operation engineer. I noticed most roles are better suited for mechanical, electrical, and civil backgrounds. Can a process engineer grow in this field? What's your opinion? Absolutely. Yep. I'm working with some fantastic process engineers right now on the project that I'm working on right now. And they're some of the smartest people that I've worked on projects with, and they're great as a member on the commissioning team. We rely on process engineers heavily because they're the ones with the expertise that's specific to the particular plant process that's being worked on site. We can't be experts in everything. We need to rely on the experts, the other experts that are involved in the project. So we bring in that process engineer expertise, that equipment expertise as needed on the commissioning team to support the overall commissioning plan, the commissioning process, help us identify some of the risks, some of the safety issues to ensure that we are implementing a proactive, risk mitigated commissioning process through all stages of the project. There's roles for every expert on commissioning projects: mechanical, electrical, civil. I wouldn't say so much civil. There's a lot of focus on mechanical systems, on electrical systems, and on automation systems. The civil is really a pre-activity, more so during construction. If we're building a dam, there's a large component of civil work to take place from a construction standpoint, for earth moving, for concrete pouring, from dam building, even on smaller projects from foundation, ground piles, all of those aspects, below grade activities. There's lots of roles for commissioning. Once we get out of the ground, then a lot of the focus is more so focused on mechanical, electrical, and automation. Of course, the building envelope and maybe some of the exterior finishes would involve civil. But when we get into the more detailed, complex aspects of what the project is actually intended to function, the plant process, the manufacturing facility, the wastewater treatment, or whatever, then we're relying on those mechanical, electrical, automation experts, as well as process engineer experts, to help us guide the technical details on our projects to ensure that everything's functioning correctly as it should. So with your plant operation experience, having that operational knowledge is a huge benefit to commissioning as well. That can sometimes get missed if the project is starting very early during design, maybe working in offices and not necessarily on site. That operational aspect, that site logistics aspect, can somewhat get overlooked or missed on projects. And we want to bring that operational knowledge more forward in the project to help people understand, how are these systems actually going to be used in the field? What are the operational implications of doing it this way or doing that way? Particularly from an automation perspective, that HMI system is the operator's user interface to the entire plant process. So getting that operational knowledge earlier in the process is hugely beneficial. And if you're looking to get into commissioning from a plant operation engineer perspective, I definitely encourage you to do so, because that knowledge is in great demand on projects, and you could add a whole lot of great knowledge to projects, to commissioning, and help projects be successful for sure. Next question, lots of good questions here. At what point do we need vendor rep? At what point do we need vendor rep on site, pre-commissioning or commissioning? It could depend. Typically, the vendor would be on site during pre-commissioning. The pre-commissioning stage would be when we're first doing some of the vendor startups. So once construction is complete, all the equipment is installed, cables are pulled, mechanical pipes are installed, all the appropriate QC, QA activities are completed, we'd be able to sign off on mechanical completion. At that point, the equipment would then be ready for startup. So we'd very much likely have the vendor on site during that first initial startup, so that they can start up their equipment, sign it off, and make sure everything is working correctly. With the vendor's participation, then once they start up the equipment and confirm that everything is correct, the commissioning teams witness or involvement of that can sign off on well. That's usually the milestone to allow payment to that vendor. If they've met all their contract requirements, the equipment's delivered to site, it functions correctly,
and all their specification technical requirements are met. We sign that off, the vendor gets paid. So that would be typically some of the early pre-commissioning activities where that would take place. That's not to say that the vendor isn't involved later as well. Once we're doing some integration testing, maybe there's additional logic changes that need to be made to the vendor's piece of equipment or on the PLC side to get things communicating correctly. Maybe the vendor needs to be involved during actual plant startup when we're starting to introduce some of the plant fluids for the first time. We want the vendor on site to monitor that process and ensure everything is going well, specific to their piece of equipment as well. So they may be required to come back to site during the actual startup activities to ensure that their equipment is still meeting specification. It also may depend on what's specified in the vendor's contract, how many trips they need to be to site, or if they need to come and address any deficiencies that are particularly noted. But I would say, just from a general standpoint, they would need to be available on site for that initial pre-commissioning vendor startup activity, and then it may just depend after that. The signal list documents and synoptics should be very detailed with a category-wise list of signals for control and protection and power signals. Absolutely, yep. We're relying on our design team to prepare all the detailed specifications from an IO list standpoint, process control narrative standpoint, a logic perspective. All of this needs to be defined in explicit detail for wiring cubicles, the I/O lists, and the logic in how the PLC logic will interact with the various I/O out of cubicles. This needs to be very explicitly detailed and defined, and is the basis of what we'll use to prepare our commissioning checklists, our commissioning plans and procedures. Is these details. Once we have all the detailed manufacturing specifications for the cubicles, we can use that to prepare, along with the PCN, our commissioning procedures in how these systems are going to be tested. If there's any errors, anything that's wrong, anything that's designed wrong, or anything that's installed wrong in that detailed list of signals, then that's going to impact our commissioning, because we're going to test it based on how it was designed. If there's problems there, then that needs to kind of go back to design to address and define how is this system supposed to function, how is it supposed to be installed, which we then may have to go adjust some of our commissioning plans and procedures. But by getting involved earlier and reviewing some of those items up front, we can maybe identify those on paper before we actually run into them into the field and have to troubleshoot and identify what's the error in the field, which can, of course, become much more costly to address. I think we have time for a few more questions here. What is the impact of equipment readiness on the commissioning process and operating, especially when sudden malfunctions appear, such as leakage of seals for rotating equipment or high temperatures for lubrication systems, as present during operation, and how can these be rectified for small projects? So if we've gone through a structured commissioning process, through everything that we've talked about in this presentation, through factory acceptance testing, through proper pre-commissioning activities, commissioning activities, then we hopefully would have gone through our equipment level readiness of testing prior to getting to some of the bigger issues. Think of pre-commissioning as testing at the equipment level. We're testing out just the pump at the vendor startup level during pre-commissioning activities. If there's any issues with that pump and it's not meeting a technical requirement, we're hopefully able to identify it during pre-commissioning during that vendor startup so that it doesn't get to later issues in testing. If that wasn't the case, though, if a structured commissioning process wasn't followed, we're deferring those risks to later in the project. Those risks are only going to be identified as we're trying to start up the system, for example, where we're experiencing leaks or high temperatures of rotating equipment. If those proper prior steps weren't taken earlier in the project, then we've lost that opportunity to proactively address some of the issues earlier, and they're going to, of course, cause us issues, as you've identified here in your question here. So that's the reason that we want to be following a proactive, de-risked commissioning process so that we can find those issues earlier. If they've gotten through, or maybe there was a installation defect that wasn't known, if pipes pass their leakage test but then spring a leak later, then that's going to cause us impacts during commissioning later. Often we're going through the different stages of commissioning related to cold commissioning, hot commissioning, dry commissioning, wet commissioning, and even in that wet commissioning using clean process fluids. So if there's a leak that exists, we hope that we would have found it during clean water testing. We're maybe using flushing water or non-potable water for that level of testing to identify those leaks that exist. We certainly don't want to be running with actual process fluids in our systems and discovering that there's a leak if we've got raw sewage in pipes or hazardous chemicals, dangerous chemicals, or oil in systems that are causing environmental disasters. We don't want to be discovering leaks at that point, because that's a much bigger issue to address and clean up. If we have to remove all those hazardous chemicals, we have to be able to handle chemicals, clean up the issues, potentially major environmental disaster spills. We don't want to be encountering those issues at that point. And that's why we're going through a structured commissioning process to test a lot of these systems to confirm that they are properly in place and ready for introduction of process chemicals before we actually get to that stage, to minimize the impact of potential delays and issues. So next question is, where can we find international standards for commissioning? So wouldn't this be fantastic if this existed? I agree with you completely. While every project is unique and there's no blanket statement that says this is how it shall be done, an international standard for commissioning standards would be hugely beneficial, at least so that everybody's using the same terminology, the same language, the same general definition of what this structured commissioning process looks like, and everybody's working towards kind of the same thought process. Right now, it's kind of all over the place. It depends on how your contract's written. Contract might define the terminology to use in this manner, and then you go to the next project, the contract defines it differently. It is quite disorganized, and I do see a huge benefit to implementing international standards for commissioning. This currently doesn't exist. There are some standards that exist for building commissioning, and they're fine if that's the area of commissioning that you're looking in, regards to the more simple building commissioning aspects. But if you're going through industrial plant process commissioning like we've been talking about in this webinar, then international standards don't exist. I will provide a glimmer of hope, as this is something that we are working on. I am professional society, and this is one of the initiatives that we intend to be working on at some point in the future, is developing that international standard of procedures, something that projects can use as a resource to rely on, and at least get reference to say this is generally the structure of how projects are going to go through commissioning, but also to get that set of standards, like you're indicating, to include in contracts up front, so that we can avoid some of these contract gaps. If we've got that agreed to set of standards, and this is the general principles and process of how to implement a de-risk commissioning process, then we can include those standards up front in our contracts and say, this is how Mr. or Mrs. Contractor, Mr. or Mrs. Owner, Consultant, whoever, this is how this project is going to proceed with regards to commissioning, and that's all known up front. That avoids some of the issues that we talked about earlier in some of the questions, is how do we get some of the project participants to participate or be on board with these commissioning activities? Well, having an international set of standards for commissioning would do exactly that. That's something we're working on. We are focusing on our event in a few weeks in Houston on November 10th. Post-event, that'll be an activity on our list to do, is to continue development of these international standards. So definitely pay close attention, keep in touch, and when those are available, we'll definitely let the commissioning community know here how they can get access to those, and how to include them in their contracts and help develop and complete some of our projects on time and on budget. So stay tuned. One more question here as we're getting to half past the hour, and then I think we'll wrap it up. If there are more questions out there, by all means, submit them. We'll try and answer them after the webinar here, but we'll keep this to the last question just so that we can wrap things up here and allow everybody to proceed with their day. So type testing at site is very problematic due to unavailable of testing kits from the OEMs and third-party suppliers like Omicron. What is your opinion? Some of these test devices, Omicron, Dowell, do have quite long lead times and can be quite expensive. Anytime that we've need some of this specialized testing equipment, it has involved some advanced planning, and again is another reason to get the commissioning team involved earlier, is to identify some of these specialized advanced test equipment that's required and make sure that there's processes in place to order them in advance. Some of these test equipment can be quite expensive. Often they can take 6 months or more. Maybe there's even more delays with the pandemic these days. And that 6 months or more lead time needs to be planned for to ensure that we have the test equipment at site that we'll need for some of our testing, and that some of these expensive items are included in the project budget to ensure that there's funds to be able to purchase them. So definitely some pre-planning is required to ensure that we have access to the specialized test equipment that we need, that we can identify what it is, we can ensure that it's in the procurement plans, and we can ensure that it's on site when needed so that testing isn't delayed. There are maybe some options to bring in a third party, the actual manufacturer, vendor of the protection relays or whatever's required. If we need to get Schweitzer on site or whoever, they can perform a lot of those activities, but they're super busy as well, and they're not always available to support the project when needed because they're supporting multiple other projects as well. So we definitely need some planning in advance if this is in-house procurement to do some of our protection testing, or if we're going to be engaging third-party groups to perform some of this testing. That planning needs to take place in advance to ensure that we get access and have the specialized test sets and test skills to be able to execute some of our testing on site. So I think with that, we'll conclude questions. Lots of great questions. I am really impressed by everyone's engagement and participation in this commissioning webinar. That shows that there's a huge interest in commissioning, and I'm happy to share my commissioning knowledge with everybody so that we can all deliver our commissioning projects on time and on budget. So I'll conclude maybe with a few things you can check out. I mentioned earlier, if you missed the beginning of this presentation, definitely go check out cpsociety.co. There's no M on the end of it. It's not com. cpsociety.co. Our event is planned in a few weeks with the Commissioning Professionals Society in Houston, Texas on November 10th. Definitely go check that out. We've got some amazing speakers that you get to hang out with for the full day, and you can ask them tons of questions exactly like we've just done in this webinar. You can pick their brain. You can have access to their decades of commissioning experience and get a wealth of knowledge. I'm looking forward to the day, so I hope to see you there. Definitely go check it out, cpsociety.co. As well, if you want to get some more information on what this de-risked commissioning process looks like and how you can implement this on your project, definitely go check out commissioningandStartup.com/mini-course. That's a 3-day mini course where you can see what a de-risk commissioning process looks like. It's a very good start. It'll give you the great introduction to what the structured commissioning process looks like and how we can minimize proactively a lot of the risks on our commissioning projects to set commissioning up for success. So definitely go check out commissioningandStartup.com/mini-course and get signed up for our free 3-day mini course. And lastly, there were some questions on where to start, on where to go next for training if you want to transition into commissioning. We do offer some more in-depth knowledge training on what this commissioning process looks like. Go to commissioningandStartup.com. At the top menu, you'll see an item called Training. Check that out, and that lists our training programs that are available. So definitely go check that out. commissioningandStartup.com. Go to the top menu, check out Training, and you'll be able to check out what our training programs look like there and how we can help you out. And of course, if you have any questions, there's a contact page on our website. Go click on contact, send us any questions that you have, and we'd be happy to help you out or have a discussion with you on how we can help you and your projects implement this de-risked commissioning process to proactively manage your commissioning risks on projects. So definitely go check that out. Send us an email. We'd be happy to get on a video call, have a chat with you, and see how we can help you out on our projects and help you implement everything that we've talked about in this presentation. So I look forward to speaking with you soon. So thanks again, everyone. I appreciate your participation. Great questions, great comments, great engagement. Happy to have you all here, and we'll do this again soon. Everyone, have a great day and hope to see you in Houston.